I had been dreading this drive for weeks. It wasn't just the hours spent alone in my car or the monotonous stretches of highway. It was the destination. My childhood home was more than just a place. It was a mausoleum of memories I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. But when my mother called to say my father was in the hospital, I knew I had no choice. It was a chilly Friday afternoon when I finally hit the road. The sun was already dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt. I had packed my bag hastily that morning, the urgency of the situation overshadowing my usual meticulousness. I kept reminding myself that this wasn't just a visit. It was a reckoning with the past. As I drove, the landscape shifted from city to suburb to open countryside, the scenery growing more desolate with each mile. Fields of corn and soybeans flanked the highway, their darkness a reminder of how isolated my hometown felt. I hadn't lived there in years, and the thought of returning to the familiar streets filled me with dread. My parents had divorced when I was in high school, and the house had remained empty since my father moved out. Felt like a tomb. I rolled down the window, letting the cool air whip through my hair, hoping it would clear my mind. But all it did was let in the smell of damp earth and the faint scent of decay. It struck me as odd how a place could smell so different from how I remembered. As I approached the small town, my stomach churned with anxiety. I hadn't spoken to my father in years, not since the day he walked out, leaving a mess of broken promises and hurt feelings behind. I pulled into the town square, a familiar yet alien landscape. The diner where I used to eat breakfast with my dad was still there, its neon sign flickering to life as darkness enveloped the streets. I considered stopping for a moment, but the thought of facing the ghosts of my childhood made me press on. Finally, I arrived at the house. It loomed in front of me just as I remembered. The paint peeling, the lawn overgrown, and the windows glaring at me as if they knew all my secrets. I parked the car and sat for a moment, taking in the sight. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, the past rushing back with a vengeance. With a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. The wooden steps creaked beneath my weight, and I could feel the chill in the air wrap around me like a shroud. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should knock or just let myself in. My mother had said she would leave the door unlocked for me, but I still felt an overwhelming need for permission. Finally, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside, the house was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of mildew. It felt like I was intruding on a grave, and I took a moment to adjust to the dimness. The living room looked the same, but it was empty, devoid of the warmth that had once filled it. Dust motes danced in the slanted light coming from the cracked windows, and everything seemed frozen in time. "Dad," I called, my voice echoing in the silence. There was no answer. I moved further into the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and the smell of cooking, now stood abandoned. The old wooden table was covered in a layer of dust, and the chairs sat askew, as if they had been hastily pushed back. I made my way to the hallway, glancing at the family photos lining the walls. They showed happier times, birthdays, holidays, moments of joy that felt like a lifetime ago. My fingers traced the faces of my younger self, my mother, and my father, each picture telling a story of a family that now felt like a distant memory. When I reached my father's bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. I knocked softly before pushing it open, a mix of apprehension and hope swirling in my gut. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight against the setting sun. I could see the outline of my father's bed, and my heart raced as I stepped inside. He was there, lying on the bed, his face pale and gaunt. Machines beeped softly around him, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling the air. I stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the years pressing down on me. My father looked so small, so frail. I hadn't seen him in years, and the sight brought a lump to my throat. "Dad," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stirred slightly but didn't open his eyes. I took a step closer, my heart aching at the sight of him. "Dad, it's me. It's Ethan." He blinked slowly, his eyes struggling to focus. When they finally settled on me, a flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by confusion. "Ethan," he croaked, his voice raspy. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, my heart pounding. "I came as soon as I heard. Mom said you were in the hospital." He let out a shaky breath and tried to sit up, but it was clear he didn't have the strength. "I didn't think you'd come," he said, his voice tinged with regret. I felt a pang of guilt at his words. "I wouldn't have missed it," I lied, forcing a smile. "How are you feeling?" He shrugged slightly, his gaze dropping to the sheets. "Not great. Just tired." I nodded, not sure what to say. The silence hung heavy between us, a chasm filled with unspoken words. I wanted to bridge the gap, to tell him that I missed him, that I wanted to understand why things had ended the way they did, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat in the chair beside his bed, taking in the sight of him. He looked older than I remembered, his hair thinning, his skin almost translucent. "Do you want me to get your nurse?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation flowing. He shook his head slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "No, I'm okay. Just tired, really." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry for everything, Ethan." His words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. I didn't know how to respond. I wanted to be angry, to tell him how much he had hurt me when he left, but seeing him there, vulnerable and frail, it all felt so complicated. I don't know what to say, Dad," I finally managed. "It's been a long time." He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "I know. I messed up. I should have fought harder to keep our family together." The air grew thick with emotion, and I felt my resolve wavering. "Why didn't you?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why did you just leave?" He let out a shaky breath, and for a moment, I saw the man I used to know, strong and unyielding. I thought it would be better for everyone. I was wrong. I see that now. Tears slipped down my cheeks, and I wiped them away angrily. "You didn't even try," I said, the anger spilling out of me. "You just walked away." "I was scared," he replied, his voice breaking. "I didn't know how to handle everything. I thought I was doing the right thing." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much pain he had caused. But instead, I just sat there, my heart heavy with the weight of our shared history. After a long silence, I finally spoke. "What do you want from me, Dad? What do you want me to do?" He looked away, his gaze drifting to the window. "I don't know. I just want to make things right. If I have the chance." "What chance?" I interrupted. "You're in a hospital bed, Dad. What do you expect me to do?" He opened his mouth to respond, but just then, a nurse walked in. She was a young woman with a warm smile, her presence instantly filling the room with a sense of calm. "Mr. Jensen, how are you feeling today?" "Just tired," my father replied, and I could see the relief on his face. The nurse began checking his vitals, and I sat quietly, my heart still racing from our earlier conversation. I felt lost, unsure of how to navigate this fragile moment between us. Once she finished, she turned to me with a knowing look. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. He's in good hands." I nodded, grateful for her presence. After she left, I turned back to my father. "You know, it's not just about you anymore," I said softly. "There are other people affected by what happened. You can't just fix everything with words." "I know," he said, his voice filled with remorse. "I just want a chance to show you that I can change." But how could I believe him? The years of hurt loomed over us like a dark cloud, and the weight of it was almost unbearable. "I need time," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I need time to figure this out." He nodded slowly, the sadness in his eyes evident. "I understand. Just promise me you'll think about it." "I promise," I said, but I wasn't sure if I could keep that promise. I spent the next few days visiting him in the hospital. Each visit felt like a step closer to forgiveness, but there were still so many unresolved feelings swirling around in my mind. I found myself caught in a cycle of anger and longing, wanting to connect with him while also wanting to protect myself from further hurt. One afternoon, as I sat beside him, he shared stories about his life since he left. They were filled with regret and sadness, and I could see how much he had changed. There was a vulnerability in him now that hadn't been there before, and it both terrified and fascinated me. "Ethan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to know that you've always been my pride and joy. I may have left, but you were always in my heart." I felt the tears welling up again, but I fought them back. "It doesn't change what you did, Dad," I said, my voice trembling. "You can't just say these things and expect everything to be okay." "I know," he said quietly, "but I hope one day you can forgive me." Those words lingered in the air, hanging heavy between us. I wanted to forgive him, to let go of the pain he had caused, but it felt like an insurmountable task. As I drove home from the hospital each evening, I felt the weight of the past pressing down on me. Memories of my childhood flooded back, those moments when everything had felt perfect before the cracks began to show. I was haunted by the what-ifs, and the fear of facing those ghosts was overwhelming. Finally, on the last night of my visit, I made my way to his hospital room, determined to confront the unspoken feelings that had been festering inside me. I needed to know if there was any hope for us. "Dad, can we talk?" I said as I entered the room. He looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us and what happened between you and Mom. I know it's complicated, but I need to understand why." He nodded, his expression earnest. "I owe you that much, Ethan. I never meant to hurt you. I was so consumed by my own issues that I didn't see how my choices affected you." I felt a knot in my stomach tighten as I listened. "But it did affect me, Dad. I carried that pain with me for years, and it shaped who I am today." "I know," he said softly, "and I wish I could take it all back. If I could go back in time, I would do things differently. I want you to know that." "Then tell me what happened," I pressed, feeling the weight of my emotions pressing down on me. "What made you walk away?" He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the sheets. "It was a lot of things. A combination of stress, loneliness, and a sense of failure. I felt like I was drowning, and I didn't know how to reach out for help. I felt a mix of anger and sympathy. But you left us. You left me. How could you think that was the answer?" "I didn't think clearly," he admitted, tears welling in his eyes. "I thought it was for the best, but I see now how wrong I was." The silence between us felt heavy, filled with the weight of our shared pain. "I want to believe you, Dad," I said finally, my voice cracking. "But it's hard. It's hard to forgive you for all of this." "I understand," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Just know that I'm here now, and I want to do better. I want to make things right if you'll let me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw a glimpse of the man I used to admire. He was flawed and broken just like the rest of us, but he was trying, and that meant something. "Maybe we can start slow," I suggested, my voice trembling. "One step at a time." He smiled faintly, relief washing over his features. "I'd like that. I really would." That night, I left the hospital feeling a sense of hope for the first time in years. The path to forgiveness wouldn't be easy, but it was a path I was willing to explore. As I drove away from the hospital, the stars shone brightly in the clear sky above, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Returning to my childhood home was no longer a journey into the past, but a step toward healing and rebuilding the connections that had once been lost. My father and I had a long way to go, but I was willing to take the ride.